How American territorial expansion, 1492 to 1776, set the stage for Cold War superpower status. Here is what you probably were not taught in school: the 3 centuries of land acquisition that built the continental United States, from the Atlantic coast in the early 1600s all the way to the Mississippi by 1783, did not just happen. It was methodical, strategic, and the very infrastructure of extraction, logistics, and territorial administration that made it work would become the skeleton of American superpower capacity nearly 200 years later. By the time the Soviet Union collapsed, Americans were still running the same fundamental systems their ancestors had built to seize a continent. Stay with me, because at the end of this history, you will see a direct line from the Fort Pitt fur traders of 1758 to the global military apparatus that won the Cold War. If you watched anything on this channel before, you know we do not deal in sentiment or mythology. So here is my ask. Subscribe right now if Cold War history is something you actually want to understand at the bone level, not the textbook level. And please, leave a comment. Tell me, what was the single moment in your own lifetime when you realized the Cold War was no longer the defining force in global politics? I genuinely want to know how people who lived through it experienced that shift. Right. So here is the thing nobody talks about. Expansion worked because logistics worked. And logistics worked because somebody had to invent the entire system from scratch. The French controlled the interior. They understood it first. From Quebec south along the St. Lawrence, then across the Great Lakes, down the Mississippi to Louisiana. The French had mapped it, traded it, and held it with a network of maybe a dozen permanent trading posts and a handful of military outposts. They did not need dense settlement. They needed information, relationships, and supply lines. They had a monopoly on knowledge of the waterways and the interior routes. The English colonies, by contrast, faced a catastrophic problem. They were packed into a 200-mile strip of seaboard. They wanted everything beyond it. But the moment they moved inland, they encountered 3 obstacles: impassable terrain, hostile indigenous nations who had zero reason to trust them, and the French already dug in everywhere that mattered. Wait, this part is important, because it changed everything that came after. The British colonies could not win by replicating the French model. They did not have the cultural relationships with indigenous peoples that the French had built through decades of intermarriage and fur trading. The British brought families, churches, and the intention to stay forever. That created a fundamental friction. So instead of compromise, they invented something else, a machine that could absorb and organize territory faster than any empire had done before. They called it the surveying system. And frankly, this is the part that still bothers me. How elegant and how ruthless it was in equal measure. Every parcel of land claimed by the British, from Pennsylvania to Virginia, was measured, plotted, and recorded before it was settled. You could hold title to land you had never even walked on. You could buy it, sell it, subdivide it, all on paper. Now listen, before we continue, because this next piece is essential to understanding the entire trajectory of American power, I should tell you, the complete guide to how territorial systems actually fueled every war and expansion the United States pursued is available in the description and pinned comment. We go much deeper into the mechanisms of administrative control and logistical supremacy that made the difference. That guide is paid, not free, but it is written for exactly the person you are right now. Someone who wants to understand how institutions work, not just what happened. The French had posts. The British had posts, yes, but the British also had property records. They had tax rolls. They had a system to know exactly how much grain each settler could produce, exactly how many militia could be raised from each county, exactly what the carrying capacity of each river was for moving supplies north toward the frontier. By 1750, the British colonies had mapped and registered nearly 200,000 square miles of territory. Most of it they did not yet occupy, but they owned it on paper, and paper ownership, if you can defend it militarily, becomes real ownership very quickly. The French realized too late that they were fighting an enemy that did not operate like they did. The French sent soldiers and fur traders. The British sent surveyors, lawyers, and settlers. The French cared about the waterways. The British cared about the land itself. And when the 7 Years' War erupted in 1754, These two systems collided head-on across 3,000 miles of contested frontier. The war itself lasted 7 years. The outcome was never really in doubt once you understood the underlying structures. France had a superior tactical army and centuries of alliance with indigenous nations. Britain had a machine. France could not outproduce Britain. France could not move supplies fast enough. France could not coordinate logistics across an army that was spread across a continent. Britain could. Britain did. And by 1763, when the Treaty of Paris was signed, the entire interior of North America, everything from the Atlantic to the Mississippi, belonged to Britain, and by extension, to the 13 colonies. That single moment of territorial acquisition created a problem that still echoes through American history. Suddenly, the colonies controlled a vastness they had claimed but not yet settled, not yet governed, and not yet paid for. The cost of defending that territory against indigenous resistance, against French recapture attempts, and against the sheer logistics of occupying a continent was staggering. It would cost the British government roughly 5,000 soldiers, stationed at posts scattered across 2 million square miles, just to hold what they had won. That was expensive, and somebody had to pay for it. Britain decided the colonies should pay. That decision, that single administrative and financial decision, created the cascade of taxation and resentment that led, within 13 years, to revolution. The Proclamation Line of 1763 was Britain's attempt to draw a boundary. Settlers could not cross westward. It sounds simple. It was not. On one side of that line lived colonists who had fought in the French and Indian War, who had lost brothers and fathers, who believed they had earned the right to expand. On the other side were Indian nations who had already lost everything: their lands, their independence, their future. Britain wanted to stabilize the border, to avoid more costly wars, to manage the debt from the one just finished. The colonies saw a barrier to their ambitions. The Indians saw the only protection left. For a moment, those interests aligned. Neither wanted more bloodshed. Neither trusted Britain's promises. Both were right not to. The real problem was money. Britain had spent an enormous sum winning the war. The national debt had nearly doubled. Every day, the interest accumulated. Parliament looked at the colonies and saw 13 territories that had benefited from British military protection, yet contributed almost nothing to the imperial treasury compared to what Britain was spending to defend them. This calculation was not entirely unfair. It was, however, politically catastrophic. Between 1763 and 1776, Britain imposed a series of taxes meant to extract revenue from America: the Stamp Act, the Townshend Duties, the Tea Act. Each one seemed reasonable to London and utterly intolerable to the colonists. The colonists had no representatives in Parliament. They had not consented to these taxes. They had also never paid direct imperial taxes before. Suddenly, they were being asked to fund a military occupation of their own territory. The irony was brutal. Colonists had expanded the empire. They had defeated the French. They had proven themselves valuable assets to Britain's global position. And for that loyalty, they were being taxed without representation and told they could not expand further westward. Wait, this part is crucial to understand what comes next. The territorial question and the taxation question were not separate arguments. They were linked. Britain wanted to restrict westward expansion partly because it was expensive to defend, partly to avoid war with Indians, but also to keep the colonies concentrated on the coast where they could be taxed and controlled. The colonies resented the taxes because they felt those taxes were being used to prevent them from claiming the lands they believed they had won and deserved. This is where the deeper mechanics of this entire conflict become visible, and frankly, this is the exact kind of territorial economic logic that our full guide digs into across multiple case studies throughout American history. The guide explores how land claims, military spending, and taxation fed into one another across centuries, not just in this period. You'll find it in the description and in the pinned comment if you want to understand the full pattern. It is a comprehensive resource, not a quick summary. By 1773, the Boston Tea Party happened. Colonists dumped tea into Boston Harbor to protest the Tea Act. It was an act of defiance, dressed up as a riot. Britain responded with the Coercive Acts, punitive legislation designed to crush rebellion before it could spread. The colonies called them the Intolerable Acts. Each name reflected the speaker's sense of righteousness. The Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia in 1774. 12 colonies sent representatives. They did not yet speak of independence. They spoke of rights, of representation, of traditional English liberties being violated by a tyrannical parliament. They drafted a declaration of rights and grievances. They wanted reconciliation on terms they found acceptable. King George III and his ministers were not interested. By early 1775, armed British troops were moving toward Concord, Massachusetts, to seize colonist weapons and ammunition. Militiamen gathered at Lexington to stop them. Someone fired. Shots echoed across the spring morning. 8 colonists fell. The war had begun. On July 4, 1776, the Continental Congress adopted the Declaration of Independence in Philadelphia. The language was revolutionary. All men are created equal, endowed with unalienable rights. Governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed. Those words did not describe Britain's relationship with its colonies. They described what the colonists believed should exist instead. The phrase was elegant. The reality was 13 colonies at war with the world's greatest military power, divided among themselves, poorly equipped, and uncertain of victory. They had militia. Britain had the world's dominant navy and a professional army. The odds were not favorable. Yet those 13 colonies won. They won because geography favored them. 3,000 miles of ocean separated them from Britain's supply lines. It won because France, Spain, and the Dutch saw an opportunity to weaken their greatest rival and poured money, ships, and soldiers into the conflict. It won because George Washington held the Continental Army together through brutal winters and catastrophic defeats. But the deepest reason had been building for a century and a half before a single shot was fired at Lexington. The colonists had learned to fight, to govern themselves, to organize militia, and to resist central authority. They had already pushed westward across the Appalachians, settled Ohio, Kentucky, and Tennessee. They had built ports and farms and mills. They had formed their own assemblies and courts. Virginia's House of Burgesses had existed since 1619. Massachusetts had its general court. These were not merely advisory bodies. They controlled taxes, they passed laws, they appointed judges. Britain had allowed this independence to grow because distance made enforcement difficult, and because the colonies were profitable. Raw materials flowed east, manufactured goods flowed west. The Crown collected tariffs and remained satisfied. But by the 1760s, Britain faced a problem. The French and Indian War had been expensive. The Crown was in debt. Someone had to pay for the army now stationed in North America to protect the colonists from future French aggression. Parliament decided the colonists should pay. The Stamp Act of 1765 taxed printed documents. Every newspaper, every legal contract, every deed required a stamp. The colonists erupted. They had never paid direct imperial taxes before. They had taxed themselves through their own assemblies. This felt like theft. Riots broke out in Boston, New York, Philadelphia. Stamp agents were burned in effigy. The act was repealed, but the principle remained unresolved. Who had the right to tax the colonists? Britain said Parliament. The colonists said only their own elected assemblies. This was not a small disagreement about revenue. It was a fundamental question about sovereignty. Over the next decade, that question would become a chasm. Before we continue, hold this in mind for a second. The founders who wrote the Declaration and fought the Revolutionary War had spent their entire lives learning self-governance. Their grandfathers and great-grandfathers had built towns, managed local affairs, fought Indians, and negotiated with governors. They had a tradition of resistance to arbitrary authority that went back to the English Civil War and beyond. If you want the complete map of how colonial resistance evolved into revolutionary consciousness, the key moments, the ideological foundations, the role of newspapers and preachers in spreading resistance, I've created a detailed guide that traces this entire arc. It's in the description and the pinned comment, and it goes far deeper than I can in this video. The guide covers the mechanisms that turned a tax dispute into a call for independence. The Boston Tea Party happened in December 1773. Colonists boarded 3 ships and dumped 342 chests of tea into the harbor in protest of the Tea Act. Britain's response was swift and harsh. The Coercive Acts, passed in 1774, closed Boston's port until the tea was paid for, revoked Massachusetts's charter, and stationed even more soldiers in the colony. The colonists called them the intolerable acts. These were the accelerants. By 1775, Massachusetts was already an armed camp. Militia companies trained regularly. Powder and weapons were stockpiled. When British soldiers marched toward Concord in April to seize a colonial weapons cache, they met armed colonists at Lexington. The shooting lasted minutes. 8 colonists died. But those casualties did something no law or pamphlet had done. They made independence real. Thomas Jefferson sat in Philadelphia during the summer of 1776 and wrote the Declaration of Independence. He did not invent the idea of natural rights or popular sovereignty. Those concepts had circulated in European and colonial political thought for decades. But Jefferson crystallized them into language that made them unavoidable. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The Declaration was not primarily a philosophical treatise. It was a legal instrument, a formal justification for rebellion against the Crown, written for European audiences as much as for colonists themselves. Every nation watching understood what it meant. A colonial possession had declared itself a sovereign nation. The war itself lasted 8 years. From 1775 to 1783, the Continental Army fought a series of campaigns that ranged from catastrophic defeats to unlikely victories. Washington lost New York. He lost Philadelphia. His army nearly starved at Valley Forge. Yet each loss taught him something. He learned to preserve his force, to avoid annihilation, to wait for opportunities. The turning point came at Saratoga in 1777. General John Stark and his militia defeated a British invasion from Canada. That victory convinced France that the colonies might actually win. French gold, French ships, and French soldiers changed the mathematics. By 1781, Cornwallis was trapped at Yorktown. His surrender effectively ended the war. Before we continue, and I need you to really pay attention to this next section, because it directly explains why America became a superpower. The mechanisms that transformed 13 colonies into a continental empire are laid out in full detail in our complete guide, which is available in the description and pinned comment. This guide unpacks the territorial strategies, the diplomatic negotiations, and the westward patterns that no textbook actually connects to Cold War dominance. If you want to understand not just what happened, but the deeper logic of how it happened, that guide is essential. The Treaty of Paris in 1783 gave the new nation something staggering. Not just independence, not just recognition. The British ceded territory all the way to the Mississippi River. Every square mile between the Atlantic and the Mississippi, from the Great Lakes to Spanish Florida, belonged to the United States. That was not inevitable. It was a negotiation victory. British diplomats could have drawn the border at the Appalachian Mountains, the line they had established in 1763 to limit westward colonial expansion. Instead, they handed over the entire interior. Why? Because they wanted to punish France. Giving the Americans the interior territory weakened French colonial ambitions in North America and strengthened British relations with the new United States as a counterweight to France. In 1783, the American population was roughly 4 million. Most lived within 100 miles of the coast. The interior was wilderness, or rather, it was inhabited by hundreds of thousands of Native Americans who had lived there for millennia. The new nation faced a fundamental choice. It could remain a compact coastal republic, or it could expand. Congress chose expansion. The Northwest Ordinance of 1787 established how new territories would be surveyed, sold, and eventually admitted as states. This was not accidental planning. It was a system, a legal framework for territorial acquisition and settlement that would repeat itself across the continent for the next 100 years. Settlers poured westward. By 1790, the population of Kentucky alone was 15,000. By 1800, it was over 70,000. The frontier moved relentlessly. Families wanted land. Speculators wanted profit. The government wanted population, tax revenue, and strategic depth. Native Americans were in the way. That is not a metaphor or a moral judgment. It is the structural fact that explains what happened next. The eastern tribes, the Cherokees, Creeks, Shawnees, and others, had survived centuries of contact. They had horses, guns, and knowledge of the land. They were not helpless. But they were outnumbered and increasingly isolated. When wars broke out, Tecumseh's Rebellion in 1810, the Creek War in 1813, they lost. Andrew Jackson defeated the Creeks at Horseshoe Bend in 1814. The victory made Jackson a national figure and opened millions of acres to American settlement. By 1830, Jackson, now president, passed the Indian Removal Act. Thousands of Native Americans were forced westward on journeys called the Trail of Tears. The Cherokee death toll alone reached 4,000. The land they left behind was divided into farms and towns and became the foundation of American wealth. This is not a digression. This is the engine. Territorial conquest and settlement created wealth, population density, and political power. Each new state added representatives to Congress and electors to the Electoral College. Population meant industrial capacity, agricultural output, and military manpower. By 1840, the United States stretched from the Atlantic to the Rocky Mountains. The population had grown to 17 million. The nation was no longer a collection of coastal colonies. It was a continental power. And the hunger did not stop there. The ideology of manifest destiny, the belief that American expansion across the continent was inevitable, even divine, had taken hold in the national consciousness. Newspapers printed it. Preachers endorsed it. Settlers lived it. Mexico held the Southwest. Britain and the United States both claimed Oregon. Both territories were vast, sparsely settled by Americans, and infinitely valuable. The question was no longer whether the nation would expand, it was how far. The Mexican-American War came in 1846. It lasted less than 2 years. Americans remember it poorly, if at all. Most history classes gloss past it in a single sentence, but that war doubled the size of the United States. It added California, Nevada, Utah, most of Arizona and New Mexico, and parts of Colorado and Wyoming. The gold rush followed. Thousands of Americans flooded into California after 1848. They built towns overnight. They extracted wealth from the earth. Railroads came next, first to connect the coasts, then to bind the interior. The Transcontinental Railroad was completed in 1869, driven by Chinese laborers paid starvation wages and worked until they broke. Here is where the connection to Cold War power becomes visible. A continental nation required a continental military. Forts dotted the West. Soldiers garrisoned them. Supply lines stretched thousands of miles. The government built infrastructure, roads, depots, communication lines, to hold the territory it had seized. The Civil War then tested that continental structure. For 4 years, the North and South tore each other apart. The North won because it possessed the industrial capacity that territorial expansion had built. Northern factories produced weapons, ammunition, uniforms, boots, ships. Northern farms fed northern armies. The wealth extracted from western lands, minerals, timber, agricultural products, flowed east and fueled the war machine. Before we go further, I need to pause here and flag something essential. The backbone of American Cold War dominance was not invented in 1945. It was forged across the previous century, in Indian dispossession, in slave labor, in continental conquest, and in the industrial infrastructure those systems created. The mechanisms that allowed the United States to mobilize as a superpower were already embedded in the nation's structure by the time the first atomic bomb fell on Hiroshima. If you want to understand how those mechanisms actually worked, how territorial expansion translated into military capacity, how population became geopolitical leverage, the complete guide on this subject is in the description and pinned comment. It goes deep into the economic and logistical pathways that few people trace. It is available there for you to dig into. By 1865, when Lee surrendered at Appomattox, the United States was a different nation. The South was in ruins. The North was stronger than ever. The West was being settled and exploited at accelerating speed. The nation possessed the largest railroad network in the world. It had the capacity to field armies numbering in the hundreds of thousands. It had the industrial base to equip them, feed them, and move them. European powers noticed. France had occupied Mexico in the 1860s, attempting to install a puppet emperor. The Monroe Doctrine theoretically prohibited such intervention, But the doctrine had always been more aspiration than law. The Union Army's presence, however, was not theoretical. Victorious troops still occupied the South. That military presence convinced France to withdraw. Britain watched American expansion with a mixture of fascination and concern. The British Empire dominated the seas globally, but the United States was becoming a power on land, with the population, resources, and industrial capacity to back territorial claims. By the 1890s, Americans were talking openly about becoming a world power. That talk was no longer dismissed as fantasy. The Spanish-American War in 1898 was the threshold. Americans defeated Spain in Cuba and the Philippines. Spain ceded Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines to the United States. Suddenly, the nation controlled territory across the Pacific and the Caribbean. American power was no longer confined to the North American continent. This expansion was not inevitable. Choices were made by politicians, generals, and industrialists, but those choices were made possible by the structure that territorial expansion had already built. By 1900, America held the framework. The continental conquest had created a nation capable of projecting power globally. The railroads, the industrial base, the confidence born from westward victory, all of it made overseas empire plausible. A nation that had taken the continent could take islands. And that is when everything changed. Not because America suddenly became imperialist, but because the structure was now in place for something far larger. The 20th century arrived. America's territorial foundation, its continental reach, its resource wealth, its manufacturing capacity, had created a superpower in all but name. The nation controlled the resources of a continent. It had the infrastructure to move those resources anywhere. It had the confidence, earned through centuries of expansion, to act on a global stage. Fast forward to 1945. The Second World War ended. Europe was in ruins. Japan and Germany were defeated. The Soviet Union had bled itself nearly dry, pushing the Nazi armies back. And America? America had no bomb-scarred cities, no refugee crisis on its soil, no armies camped on its border. America had the atomic bomb, the world's largest navy, the intact industrial base, and the natural resources of an entire continent at its disposal. None of that happened by accident. The territorial expansion that began in 1492 had created a nation physically separated from the world's conflicts. Generations of Americans had built infrastructure, accumulated resources, and refined the machinery of state power across the width of a continent. By the time the 20th century's great wars arrived, America stood apart, untouched, wealthy, and ready. This is the secret I promised you at the beginning. The reason the United States emerged from the Cold War as the sole superpower was not simply because it had better weapons or a better ideology. It was because 3 centuries of territorial expansion had created a nation with the geographic isolation, resource wealth, industrial capacity, and psychological confidence necessary to compete globally for half a century. Every mile of railroad built westward, every resource extracted from conquered land, every victory over indigenous peoples and rival powers, every choice to expand rather than consolidate. All of it had prepared America for the role it would play after 1945. The Soviet Union, by contrast, had expanded across a continuous landmass, consolidating power in a region surrounded by hostile neighbors and difficult geography. It had built an empire, yes, but not the kind that could sustain a global competition with a nation that had an ocean on each side and a continent full of resources behind it. When you understand this history, the Cold War itself comes into focus differently. America's apparent advantages, its economic power, its technological innovation, its alliance system, were not gifts. They were built. They were the accumulated result of choices made centuries earlier, the decision to keep expanding, the willingness to do whatever it took to push the frontier westward, the refusal to accept limits. That territorial DNA would shape how America approached the Soviet Union. It would shape nuclear strategy, military spending, the competition for influence in the Third World, even the space race itself. A nation born from expansion would not accept a world divided in half. It would compete. It would push. It would keep moving. That impulse, to expand, to dominate, to refuse constraint, had been cultivated for 300 years. By 1945, it was simply American nature. Understanding this changes how you see the decades that followed. The Korean War was not just about stopping communism. It was a nation accustomed to expansion refusing to accept limits on its sphere. Vietnam was not simply ideological. It was a superpower, shaped by its own history, unable to tolerate a world it could not control. Even the space race was territorial expansion by other means. Americans taking the frontier, this time, to the moon. The superpower that faced down the Soviet Union was, in its bones, the same nation that had conquered a continent. The methods changed, the geography changed, but the impulse remained unchanged. Your task this week is simple. Look at one decision America made during the Cold War. Any conflict, any arms buildup, any alliance. Ask yourself, would a nation with a different territorial history have made the same choice? Once you see the connection between expansion and superpower behavior, you will see the entire Cold War differently. Thank you for staying with this entire journey, from 1492 all the way to the nuclear age. If this way of seeing history resonates with you, subscribe so you never miss a new episode. Like this video, leave a comment telling me which Cold War moment you now understand differently, and hit the notification bell. We have more centuries of hidden history waiting to be uncovered.